Good evening once again. While this was indeed day 83 of the Biden administration, if you've been watching, then you no doubt know by now this is also a tense night in the Twin Cities. Already on edge, of course, because of the trial of Derek Chauvin happening just about 10 miles away. Tonight, a dusk to dawn curfew is in effect amid a second night of protests after police in the Minneapolis suburb of Brooklyn Center, it's just north of the city of Minneapolis, shot and killed a black man at point-blank range during a traffic stop over the weekend. Last night, demonstrations were followed by looting and violent confrontations with police officers. National Guard members called out to patrol the streets. The anger and grief erupted after 20-year-old Daunte Wright was shot and killed during a traffic stop Sunday afternoon as police tried to arrest him for an outstanding misdemeanor warrant. Officials released body camera video of the shooting earlier today. Our usual fair warning, it's disturbing. The officer who fired that gun has been identified as Kim Porter, a 26-year veteran of the Brooklyn Center, Minnesota Police Department. She's now on administrative leave. During a news conference with the mayor, the chief of police described the events just before the shooting, including why Officer Potter repeated the words taser 3 times.
It is my belief that the officer had the intention to deploy their taser, but instead shot Mr. Wright with a single bullet. This appears to me, from what I've viewed and the officer's reaction and distress immediately after, that this was an accidental discharge that resulted in the tragic death of Mr. Wright.
My position is that we cannot afford to make mistakes that lead to the loss of life.
Does he support Kirby's firing?
I do.
The police chief followed up those comments by saying there would be an examination of the video before a final decision was made on Officer Potter's fate. Tonight, the medical examiner in the region has ruled the shooting of Daunte Wright a homicide. Earlier at the White House, the president acknowledged the community's anguish as he condemned violent protests.
There is absolutely no justification, none, for looting, no justification for violence. Peaceful protest, understandable. And the fact is that, we do know that the anger, pain, and trauma that exists in the black community in that environment is real. It's serious and it's consequential. But it will not justify violence and or looting. And so the question is how we, in an orderly way, make clear that they get down to a full-blown investigation to determine what the facts are and what is likely to happen. In the meantime, we're calling for peace and calm.
As we mentioned, this latest shooting took place not far to the north from the Minneapolis courthouse, where former police officer Derek Chauvin is on trial in the death of George Floyd. Today, the judge denied the defense request to fully sequester the jury to shield members from receiving any outside media coverage. This was day 11 of the testimony, which included George Floyd's brother.
He just was like a person that everybody loved around the community. He just knew how to make people feel better. He would always say, hold on, let me kiss mama before I come over there. And being around him, he showed us like how to treat our mom and how to respect our mom. He loved her so dearly.
There was also more expert testimony today about the cause of Floyd's death and the actions of Derek Chauvin.
I can state with a high degree of medical certainty that George Floyd did not die from a primary cardiac event, and he did not die from a drug overdose.
Taking into account all of the evidence that you reviewed, do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to whether Mr. Floyd's death was preventable?
Yes, I believe that Mr. George Floyd's death was absolutely preventable.
If Mr. Floyd had simply gotten in the back seat of the squad car, do you think that he would have survived?
Had he not been restrained in the way in which he was, I think he would have survived.
An expert on the use of force then told the court what is apparent to so many of us, that no reasonable officer would have acted the way Chauvin did.
You have an opinion to a reasonable degree of professional certainty as to whether the type of force used by the defendant on George Floyd on May 25, 2020 constituted deadly force.
No reasonable officer would have believed that that was an appropriate, acceptable, or reasonable use of force.
The judge told the jury that the defense will likely start presenting its case tomorrow and that closing arguments could begin as soon as next Monday. This all comes as more and more Americans have seen the other video of a police encounter that is receiving so much attention. This one shows a U.S. Army officer getting pulled over and eventually pepper sprayed and cuffed by two members of the Windsor, Virginia police force. NBC News correspondent Jeff Bennett shows us what unfolded.
Public outrage is mounting over this traffic stop.
Open the door!
Captured from several angles as police draw their weapons.
How many occupants are in your vehicle?
It's only myself. Why are your weapons drawn? What's going on?
Two officers stopping U.S. Army Lieutenant Caron Nazario for not having a rear license plate on his new SUV, according to a police report, which also notes they later saw a temporary tag inside, taped to the tinted window.
I'm serving this country and this is how I'm treated.
Yo, guess what? I'm a veteran too. I'm gonna obey.
I'm honestly afraid to get out. Can I ask you what's going on?
About a minute later, Officer Joe Gutierrez, whose termination was announced late Sunday, pepper sprays Nazario.
Get out of the car now!
That's
out of the car now!
I'm trying to breathe. Ugh.
Gutierrez and his former partner Daniel Crocker now facing a $1 million lawsuit, alleging a violation of constitutional rights. Nazario, who is black and Latino, says it was due to racial profiling.
Take off your seatbelt and get out of the car.
Look, I'm just gonna please.
You're gonna do what you're told.
And with that, let's bring in our leadoff guests on this Monday night with so much in front of us to discuss. Shauna Lloyd, she is a managing partner with the Cochran firm in Orlando. Among her areas of legal expertise, cases dealing with wrongful deaths and civil rights violations. Also back with us tonight is Carmen Best, former police chief in the great city of Seattle, and Jason Johnson, a campaign veteran journalist, contributor to the GRIO, most importantly, a professor of politics and journalism at Morgan State University. Well, good evening and welcome to you all. Chief Best, I'd like to begin with you. Adrenaline is a powerful chemical, not as powerful as a 9mm in the wrong hands. Correct me if I'm wrong, but officers are trained to carry their weapon on the side of their dominant hand and their taser on the side opposed to that. Obviously, tasers are bright yellow and lightweight for a reason. Obviously, a 9mm is a 9mm. So talk about how this might happen. Is it adrenaline? Is it training? Is it a mixture of those two and the intersection of bias?
Well, Brian, you bring up some really good points. I mean, the taser is certainly by design meant to look and feel different than your weapon, than a handgun would. You know, I've heard officers say that they could tell the difference between a taser and a handgun if they were blindfolded. So they are by design meant to be different by their grip, by their weight, and often by the color of the taser as compared to the gun. And then just as you noted, usually the taser is carried on your less dominant side, not on your handgun side. So that way there's less likely the potential to confuse the two. It is very perplexing how that could happen. You know, I don't want to speculate too far, but certainly that's one of the reasons that's potentially given as a confusion over what was being drawn. But it's very difficult to understand how that would happen under these circumstances. We know that there'll be a further investigation. But this is a very, very rare instance where there's confusion between the two. And I think both TASER and training has worked really hard to make sure that officers don't make that mistake. So there's a lot to be determined here about how that happened and how we had this tragic and horrible incident because of what could have been, you know, a mistake or confusion about the two. It's just very unusual, particularly as when you pull out your TASER, it usually lights up.
Jason, my friend, think about what it is we're talking about here tonight. There's so much you-know-what coming down. We should all be wearing a hat, I guess. And I'm going to play for you a bit more of the video from the altercation in Virginia. A young U.S. Army lieutenant, a guy we would trust our children to, a guy our country trusts our warfighting to, pulled over by these two police officers. Let's listen. We'll react on the other side.
We'd be done by now. It's a simple traffic violation.
Mr. Nazario, look, you want to stop in a well-lit area because you're nervous.
Yes.
The whole BLM movement, you're probably nervous and all that. They feel the same way. They're nervous for their jobs and their lives. I get where you're coming from. They get where you're coming from. But let's let this pepper spray kind of wear off and stuff, and then just have an intelligent conversation with them.
So, Jason, as you see, after the incident, they decided to have an intelligent conversation. The young lieutenant drove for 1 minute and 40 seconds after they lit up his vehicle because, as he put it, he was going to a brightly lit area because he feared what might happen. And, of course, look at what eventually happened nonetheless. Jason, what do you make of any or all of it?
Brian, the disgusting racial gaslighting of we can shoot you in the face with pepper spray and now you have to have a calm and reasonable conversation. The fact that this man serves this country, which means combat, and yet still fears the police is exactly why people talk about abolishing the police. Every single one of these instances we're talking about tonight, Brian, are armed, racist, and I'm sorry, it's just racist. When you see the initial video and a guy's like, hey, I'm afraid to get out of the car, and the reaction is, you should be. Why should he be? Why should he be? I'm driving around in a car right now that's got tags on the back, temporary tags, because where I've moved to. This is something that you can't reform. This is something that you can't train people out of. Police departments need to be abolished in significant ways and rebuilt. I know that seems like a radical idea, but I'm sick and tired of video after video after video of murdered black people and the president of the United States talking about looting before he talks about endemic violence by the state. There is no reason for an officer to be carrying a gun for a routine traffic stop. There is no reason for an officer to pull out a gun or a taser because somebody has air fresheners and little pine trees flopping back and forth in their windows. That is why people are angry. And until we have political leadership in this country, not just investigations, but political leadership that's willing to say, we have to tear these police departments down, just like a corrupt school, just like a dysfunctional hospital, just like a bad water treatment plant. Until we have that kind of reaction from politicians, we're just going to see this violence over and over and over again, and people protesting and nothing changing.
I'm coming back to you, Jason, on several of the points you just raised. But Shauna, to you, with thanks for your patience and welcome to the broadcast. Let's go to the other tragedy, the slow-rolling tragedy we've been covering after the death of George Floyd. The defense opens tomorrow. How high is the bar to get one juror to instill a reasonable doubt? And do courtroom professionals, given the nature of voir dire and what you learn about jurors, do you think they'll have a juror in mind who they view as maybe turnable?
Absolutely. I mean, as you're going through these types of trials, you're paying attention to the body language, how the jurors are receiving information, which ones latch on to points that have been made in the past. That's absolutely a portion of the trial because you're looking for a juror that you can instill or at least give ideas that may start to foster reasonable doubt. The state has laid a very strong foundation. They've brought in experts in every area in which to cover and make sure that their foundation is very strong for their case in chief. I think the defense has a very high bar to meet, but I think what you're going to see them do is bring in these experts to combat the information that the state has been putting out. So this is what we're going to see as the battle of the experts start to come from the defense.
Chief Best, when you hear Dr. Jason Johnson say what he just said, when you see the signs in the crowd tonight in Minnesota, I saw more than one sign saying, abolish the police. We've already lived through the phraseology, defund the police. This is your life's work. The city you served, I would argue, has not yet recovered from what happened there this past summer. How does it all make you feel? And what do you want to tell civilians about your line of work?
Well, Brian, it's really tragic and it's disheartening, of course. You know, and I cannot personally get behind the idea of abolishing the police department, but I also recognize that there's a lot of work to do and reimagining and figuring out how we're going to move forward. And these last few days have certainly brought that to the forefront in many ways. I do think that there needs to be a lot of work done, but I also, as you noted, spent almost 30 years in policing, and I recognize that there are thousands and thousands of hardworking men and women who really do want to come to work and do the best every day. Yet, we have to acknowledge that there are way too many people, particularly Black and brown people, who are dying at the hands of police. And we really have to dig deep and figure out how we're going to turn this around in a way that we have better results. I mean, absolutely. People are sick and tired of being sick and tired. That said, I think there's an opportunity if we really just keep reaching deeper to turn this around, to have the good that can happen from public safety happen. But I cannot not acknowledge, right, the problems that we have and that we still face, not only in policing, but, you know, across the board in our society, healthcare, education, all of it, the issues of race and racism and how they permeate in so many different areas.
Professor, now we've come back to you. You know that in the real world, the phrase defund the police had colossal consequences across the country for the Democratic Party, especially depending on the race, just as the phrase abolish the police will. You know the counter argument that, God forbid, you hear a bump in the night in your home or apartment, you call 911. You don't want a social worker showing up tonight. I am guessing you'd rather have an armed police officer if you have trouble in your house.
I'm just as likely to get shot by that cop as I am what the potential intruder is. That's just the reality. That's a reality that I live with every day. And I'll also say this. You know, from a political science perspective, no, it actually, if you look at the one seat that Democrats actually picked up in the state of Georgia, the congressional seat, the woman, the doctor whose name escapes me right now, she was actually out there protesting with Black Lives Matter. This is a white woman. She got elected in Georgia. I know that many people tried to argue. I know that Congressman Clyburn tried to say that defund the police and abolish the police hurt Democrats. There's no statistical information right now, polling information that shows that actually kept anybody from winning their seats. Here's the larger issue. Policing, the way it has functioned in this country, no longer works. If there was a public school where every couple of months you had a kid die in the cafeteria, you would shut down that school. You would fire every teacher. You would rebuild the entire school and say, hey, this isn't working. Kids shouldn't be dying in the cafeteria on a regular basis. If you had an emergency room where doctors and patients were dying on a regular basis for routine checkups, you would say, hey, there is something wrong with this hospital. We got to fire everybody there and start from the beginning. For some reason in America, when we see consistent failures on the part of police departments, suddenly everybody says that can't be abolished. We have everybody from the far right to the far left saying we can get rid of everything from the Environmental Protection Agency to the National Education Board. Why can't we do the same thing with police? There are ideas out there. There are policies. There are ways these can be managed. I'm not saying that you should never have somebody with a gun. I'm not saying that there aren't times that there's an armed shootout that you shouldn't have people there who have guns and weaponry. But the armament level of police and the responsibilities that they're held to do not match. You don't need to have as many cops armed in the way that they are doing social work and traffic stops. And that's where this needs to change. And politicians need to admit that, regardless of how wedded we are to the idea of police keeping us safe, when actually they're actually more dangerous to a lot of black people than they are a place of protection.
Counselor, back over to you, and you get the last word to reward you for your patience. Back to the Chauvin trial. Is there any upside to putting Derek Chauvin on the stand, knowing what could happen to him during cross?
The only upside is that the jurors will hear from the person who was there during the act. All of his actions, his training have been discussed around him. The only thing that he can do at this point would be to provide context to the jury. The only downside to that is going to be that he opens himself up to cross-examination, which in light of all the other testimony can be very damaging. So it's a very fine balance, because the only persons that the jurors have not heard from is Mr. Chauvin. However, opening yourself up to that level of cross-examination and whether or not he has anything of value that the jurors will latch onto is a very risky proposition.
Jason, just to start where you and I left off, one way of looking at this tragedy, at this story, is that a 20-year-old man is no longer alive after getting pulled over. Period. Full stop. A death should not have been the result in this case.
Yeah, Brian, and that's why people are angry. And they're justifiably angry, and they're tired of excuses, and they're tired of excuses from the government, and they're tired of excuses from police, and they're tired of being told that this is something that can simply be fixed by training and discussions. And I want to take this out into a larger frame that I think people need to understand. It's not lost on me, it's not been lost on many of us, that when we saw the insurrection at the Capitol, there's speculation, there have been analysis that upwards of 20% of the people who attacked the Capitol of this country were in law enforcement. We have problems in the attitudes and the belief systems all throughout law enforcement. And so when we see it at a micro level, when we see a simple traffic stop result in a 20-year-old being dead, when we saw Sandra Bland several years ago, a simple traffic stop, and somehow she ends up mysteriously dying in jail, there is a legitimate reason for people to be skeptical. And the answers that have been offered through the Obama administration, the Trump administration, the Biden administration haven't fixed these problems. And that's where I think we really need to focus. The time for discussions and recriminations and sadness and thoughts and prayers, we're beyond that. We need to start talking about real solutions, and what's been offered so far isn't changing anything.